Hello, David Rothenberg. Are you there?
I'm here, absolutely.
Good to have you on Blogging Heads. I am John Horgan. I am a science journalist and occasional correspondent on science for Blogging Heads TV. And with me today is an old friend and neighbor, David Rothenberg, who lives, I don't know, a few hundred yards just north of where I live here in Cold Spring. So, David, just please briefly introduce yourself to the Blogging Heads audience.
Thanks so much, John. I'm David Rothenberg. I'm a musician and a writer and a professor of philosophy and music at the New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark, New Jersey.
David, actually, we work pretty close together, too. So NJIT is right down the Jersey Turnpike, I think, from where I work at Stevens Institute.
That's right, absolutely. We're the competition. We're the school of the people. You're the school for the elite who can afford to go to your wonderful campus overlooking Frank Sinatra Drive and the Hudson River.
Okay, it doesn't feel that way from my perspective, but I totally accept that. So, David, you, I think, have one of the coolest careers of anybody I know. It just seems like you completely pursue your own passions, whether that's environmental philosophy or music. You have written a lot of really interesting books. Particularly recently, you have a series of books that are all looking at the same topic from different angles, and that topic, I would say, is beauty. Beauty as produced by humans, but also beauty in the natural world. So I wonder if you could just tell us how you got interested in that and briefly describe the first two books that you wrote on that topic.
Thanks, John. You know, I've for a long time been interested in what the connections might be between, first of all, between music and the natural world, and in the larger sense between art and human interest in aesthetics and beauty and the natural world. I guess I started out really being interested in nature and the environment and wandering around in the woods when I was a kid. We also grew up close to each other in Connecticut. And, being interested in nature at the same time being interested in music and in science and things and trying to connect these things. And over the years, I've gotten more interested in how we can use the arts in a way, aesthetic, creative approaches to understanding the world to make sense of what's going on in nature and how other species make sense of the world. Mm-hmm. And in these previous books, I started out I wrote a book called Why Birds Sing, which is a lot about not just what birds are doing, but about my attempts to make music live together with birds and use music to understand the kind of music that they are making, as well as an investigation of why I think a bird song is music and not really language, much closer to music. So I started with that, and then I moved on to whales, because whales, particularly humpback whales, also sing long, beautiful, amazing songs. And we know very little about what they're doing. We only discovered it at the end of the 1960s, and so you see what the discovery of this amazing whale song does to human understanding of what nature can be. And this latest book is like an overarching sort of theory, kind of explaining what connects these previous things, and it also branches out into visual art, not just being about music.
To you, I think it's fair to say that you're really interested in what science has to say about beauty, whether it's manifested as music, as birdsong or whale song, or as visual beauty. You're interested in what science has to say, but you're also dissatisfied with what a lot of scientists have to say about beauty in the natural world. So I wonder if you could start by talking about, for example, Darwin. How did Darwin deal with beauty in the natural world?
Well, yes, I think your view is kind of correct how I see things. I'm very interested in the way science makes sense of the world and the amazing tools it has to investigate the world around us. However, sometimes, particularly on the questions that interest me, I find science isn't always asking the most interesting questions when it comes to the issue of why nature is so beautiful and why animals are doing beautiful things. Science often doesn't dare to ask the kind of questions it could. However, I think Charles Darwin did dare to answer those questions, and I don't have that much critical to say about Charles Darwin on these questions. And I'm very impressed that in his book Descent of Man, that he devotes at least 2 chapters entirely to birds, and he says birds have a natural aesthetic sense. They appreciate beauty. That's why they have such beautiful feathers and patterns and sing such beautiful songs. You'd be hard-pressed to find a scientist today that would say something like that so clearly.
Really? Yeah, that was a pretty radical thing for Darwin to say back then, and maybe it's even more radical today. Would many modern biologists say that that's anthropomorphizing birds to say that they have a sense of what's beautiful?
That's right. They might say that. And in fact, a lot of what Darwin said in his time was completely radical. And it's an interesting question as to whether something like that is more or less radical then and now. I suspect it's actually less radical in Darwin's time to say something like that, because there wasn't as clear a split between science and like what naturalists do, observing nature and making sense of the world around. Scientists could get away with doing things like that. So Darwin saying something like that might have seemed less radical in his time than saying that human beings descended from monkeys and that we're all connected, this kind of thing. The beauty stuff might have been received better. Although, if you look at what the mainstream view was afterwards, what he said about beauty and females deciding what's beautiful through sexual selection, that met with a lot of criticism.
Well, so describe that a little more. As I recall, Darwin was stumped for a while about the really flamboyant beauty of some animals. I think the classic example is the tail of the peacock, and that led to his theory of sexual selection. So can you just elaborate a little bit on
That's right. That's right. I mentioned in my book, the new book, Survival of the Beautiful. I hold it up for you.
All right.
In case you don't believe it exists. Notice there's a peacock's tail right here. It's held down, a down-furled peacock's tail. It's not opened up. Like the peacock is walking shamefully, carrying his tail folded up. But Darwin himself, he wrote to one of his colleagues, the peacock's tail, well, there's something that really makes me sick. Why did it make him sick? He couldn't explain it by natural selection, by the idea of an adaptation, that something so flamboyant, so much work to carry around, seemed so inefficient, could have evolved in a world guided by the principle of survival of the fittest, the most useful, the most appropriate kind of adaptations of which many animals illustrate all the time. How could this tail exist if evolution really was just survival of the fittest? Mm-hmm. A whole other side of evolution, Darwin realized, must be about something else. Survival of the beautiful, survival of the cool, the interesting, the weird. And what it could be almost anything, because it depends on female preference over the generations. In general, natural selection is very strong, and you lead to, say, birds are good examples because there's so many of them, they're relatively easy to see. So many useful, efficient little species like sparrows and starlings, and maybe they have a little bit of ornamentation, a little red crest or a red spot on their breast. By and large, they're kind of efficient. They've evolved very usefully. Sometimes it gets really extreme. And in those cases, generations of females have just decided they like some extreme trait, and they push it generation after generation to like something that may not be useful, but they just like it. And that's the case in the peacock's tail. Sexual selection. It doesn't matter what it is, according to this theory, just the fact that it could be preferred. Usually extreme such behaviors are not preferred, but sometimes they are.
Now, is it fair to say that modern biologists would try to look at something like the peacock's tail, another example of sexual selection, of a really unusual trait that sexual selection is thought to have created, is the enormous antlers on certain kinds of deer, which functionally are sort of problematic because they could get stuck in trees as the stag is trying to run away or whatever. But is it fair to say that most modern biologists try to find some purely functional, practical purpose for some of these sexually selected traits?
Yes, you're speaking of early, the great Irish elk, an animal we only know from fossils, and kind of moose, with horns so big that it couldn't continue to survive. They just died out of sheer excess. They overdid it. The females just liked it too much. It was a hopeless species. They just couldn't keep going. They just liked the giant antlers so much they could barely carry them around. How true that story is, I don't know too much about that one, but it's a great idea. This idea that you could overdo things. You're right that today, biology is not happy with this idea that something could just be preferred for its own sake, that these traits must indicate something practical and useful. And so there's the notion that they are honest advertisements. Modern sexual selection theory says that the great, beautiful, best, most perfect peacock's tail shows this is the healthiest animal, the one you really should mate for because he has the best genes. The rest of he's the strongest one. He represents everything a peacock should be in terms of that this tail honestly shows this is the healthiest one around. You should mate with this animal. On the other hand, Darwin really was saying the thing about this bird with the big tail is just that. He's got a big tail. Everything else could be a mess with him. Just the tail is there. And that you're selecting for something purely because you find it beautiful rather than it indicating something useful and practical. This might seem a subtle distinction to some, but it's really a large one in terms of thinking how to explain the beauty that we find in nature that is sexually selected. Is it indicating something practical about these animals, or is it a trait that is preferred simply because it is preferred? That it doesn't indicate anything. It could indicate lack of quality.
Another one of the explanations I've heard is that it's a way of demonstrating that you're so incredibly fit that you can afford to have this extravagance that might actually slow you down. The enormous tail. It would be the equivalent of a young guy who's trying to show off for the ladies having a really fabulous leather coat or an extremely expensive car that is much more than he needs in any kind of practical sense, but just shows that he's got assets to burn.
That's right. That's kind of known as the Zahavi handicap hypothesis, that it just shows you, I'm so cool I can carry around this big useless tail. I can afford this. And this is an idea put forth by the Israeli biologist Amos Zahavi. And it's kind of the idea you often see in biology textbooks today. I was rather surprised to learn there's almost no evidence for this hypothesis at all, but it's repeated and presented because it makes sexual selection part of natural selection. Mm-hmm. It eliminates any kind of tension between these things. It eliminates the vision of a world that's a little bit more confusing and unclear, and where beauty might matter for its own sake. And there's larger examples of more problematic ones, I would say, in biology in terms of this issue. The biggest one being the selection of certain model organisms to study, and at the same time ignoring other creatures that might be more interesting. Mm-hmm. Like we know why do birds sing? Okay, the standard answer is they sing to defend territories and attract mates. So they're saying, "Here I am," against all the other males, back off, or "Here I am, I'm pretty interesting, listen to this beautiful song," to the females. So the function is to defend territories and attract mates. All right? End of story. That's what it says in your biology book. That's the function of birdsong. But how come all the birds are singing different songs? The nature of the song is so different from one species to another. A nightingale might need to sing for hours and hours to defend his territory, to attract mates. A chickadee is just going, doo-doo. That's his whole song. The function is the same. So if the functional explanation is what you want, those things are the same. Functional explanation says nothing about the real difference between what is actually done, why the nightingale might need this long, complicated song. And when you get to that point, biology would like to say it's very simple. The bird with the loudest song, with the most notes, this is the one that has the most mating success. Mm-hmm. So excess, more is what matters. Very nice. Except it turns out this is only true in very few species. These are the only species in which there's extensive work done in biology. Like in Europe, you have the sedge warbler, The sedge warbler sings more notes, they have more mating success. Very nice. There's a lot of papers on the sedge warbler. If you want to go study biology and birdsong, your advisor might say, why don't you do some more work on the sedge warbler? We need to support this model some more. The only problem is there's about 25 other related warblers of this type in Europe, all with beautiful, complicated songs. And in those other birds, the complexity correlates with nothing whatsoever. They don't want to tell you that. They don't want you to study those birds. For example, the European marsh warbler. I'm sorry I'm going on and on about this.
No, that's okay.
It's a pretty good story that the European marsh warbler, one of my favorites, this does a very amazing thing. Many birds migrate to Africa from northern Europe. Then they come back in the spring and start to sing. But only the European marsh warbler learns hundreds of African bird songs and sings them one after another really, really quickly, like a high-speed bird song identification tape. Figures out all these songs one after another so fast, It's amazing, first of all, that anyone figured this out. And secondly, it's remarkable, how could such a thing have evolved? What's it for? Turns out among the few people who have studied this against the advice of their advisors and everyone else, they say, well, it doesn't seem they're being very competitive about this. It seems the males just get together in a tree and sing all together like a vast jam session. And, they seem to just be enjoying this behavior rather than staking out territory using this song. And as soon as the females show up, they come a little bit later, the males just stop singing. So the females don't get to hear the song and assess it and wonder about it. Like, what's it really about? We don't know. And this is an amazing example of bird music, and nobody has really studied this because it's a story that doesn't fit this general simplistic model of how birdsong is supposed to work. And so I would say biology is afraid of the truth that nature is full of weird, cool, beautiful things that may not correlate with anything, and they don't even want to investigate that because it makes things look too confusing.
It strikes me as an odd example of, I thought that it was one of the points of Darwin. It's always struck me as a sort of odd contradiction that modern biologists, many of them, are so afraid of being accused of anthropomorphism, of projecting human qualities on other animals, when it seems to me that one of the insights offered by evolutionary theory is that we have so much in common with other animals. And so what you're saying seems to me to be as simple as attributing something like joy to other species. Joy at just the sheer fact of being alive and having some of these capacities, like song, for example, or even physical movement. I know there's a place just north of where we live here in Cold Spring where eagles roost and have their young very late in the year. It's happening right now probably. And I've been up there and have seen the young eagles learning to fly, and they look like they're dancing in the air. It looks so joyful and exuberant, and I guess a biologist would say even that is functional. They're learning how to fly. They're just practicing. But it looks like play, what we would call play. And doesn't it seem peculiar to you that biologists should be so reluctant to attributing joy and doing something just for its own sake to other animals?
Yeah, I think I do, and I think there's, of course, plenty of biologists interested in this kind of thing, but they remain in the vast minority in the field. And why is it that it's somehow more objective to look statistically and count the most? That's somehow objective, whereas sensing joy is somehow anthropomorphic. I think the statistical interest in counting everything and believing that the most and the loudest is more objective is just as anthropomorphic as even more anthropomorphic than actually taking what the animals are doing, paying attention to it, and trying to say what really seems to be going on here without this prejudice of I want to find that the bird that does the most interesting thing is the most fit. That's what I need to find. Otherwise, there's nothing to find. And
it seems to me that it's reductionism. I mean, I think reductionism is kind of what science does, and it shouldn't necessarily be viewed in a derogatory sense. But reductionism isn't working when it leads you just to exclude certain things because they don't fit into your model.
Yeah, you could do reductionism on the questions that interest me. Like, let's find out what the best Nightingale song is. I think you will find that females prefer something, but it's not the most notes. It's not the loudest. It's something that has a certain aesthetic quality to it, because these songs are very organized. They're very much like pieces of music with a real sense of form, rules, and a way of being put together. And no one's really studied that because scientists think that's too anthropomorphic or subjective. And actually, if you got some musicologists together with these biologists, they'd probably say that, when we study music, we look at it in a scientific way. We're not just putting our opinions here. We just believe you can be scientific about, the way sound is organized and study it very rigorously. And I've just been, in the beginning, a lot of scientists were angry with what I said in Why Birds Sing. They said, look, you don't know anything about science. Why are you criticizing us? But now, like 6 years later, I've gotten a handful of scientists to want to work with me and help use a more musical approach to understand what birds are doing. I do think this is an important area for understanding animal communication. Because why I think bird song is really music is, these long phrases, and particularly I'm speaking of complex bird song, mockingbirds, nightingales, things like that really interest me. That what these birds are doing is they're making music. They're performing something with a beginning, a middle, and an end, real shape and form, really right and wrong ways to play things. But you can't translate the whole performance into like a sentence where each part expresses some specific thing, like words. It's a performance. It's like, what does a piece of music mean? You can't say. You just know that there's a right and wrong way to do it. There's a sense of aesthetic, and I think each of these species has its own aesthetic. It takes a while to understand each of them, but by and large, we haven't spent enough time trying to ask the questions to learn how these things work. But there's something there. It could be investigated using the reductionist scientific approach. Me, I'm not quite a scientist. I don't. It's not exactly what I'm doing. I like playing music with birds. I learn musically from them and with them in an interesting way. But I do think that scientific students of music and the arts can work a lot with scientists to make sense of what animals are doing.
You introduce a term in your new book called aesthetic selection. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
I mean, basically, I suggest that sexual selection could be called aesthetic selection, because what it is the females of a species that has extreme sexual selection, like complex bird songs or peacock's tails, or my favorite Bowerbirds in Australia and New Guinea, who make sculptures, who build these beautiful artworks, mistakenly thought by people to be nests, but they're not nests. They have no practical use except as an artwork to entice the females to come assess what the males have made. I think that these are examples where an aesthetic has evolved in the species through generations of female preference. Females are the ones, their brains hold this aesthetic. The males are just doing what the females want. Without thinking about it, they just have to. It's in their very evolved genetic nature in many cases. That it's a sense of aesthetic that has evolved and that is selected for. So sexual selection makes it seem like it's all about sex. Sex is the mechanism that leads to the furthering of the aesthetic from generation to generation. Why does the peacock have this particular shape and form and color on its tail? Because the females like that. They like that.
They like it. Yeah. Is it possible for you to hold up a picture? I mean, you've got some amazing art.
Yeah, we have very cool pictures, in here. Let's see what we would like to see.
This is of the Bowerbirds. And
yes.
You really start your book off with this wonderful extended riff on the Bowerbirds and how different scientists, especially one guy in particular, Richard Prum, have tried to make sense of them, of their artwork.
Here we've got very nice. This is it looks like a kind of shelter made out of rushes and reeds. And it's got these orange and black things in it. What this is an artwork made by a Vogelkopf's bowerbird in New Guinea. It's not a nest, it's not a shelter, it's just a structure with very carefully decorated in orange and black with these piles of colored things. To impress the females, they come look at it. It's like, come look at my artwork. And it's really very cool. And, you imagine how much time these birds spend in one place making this. People using a handicap hypothesis say, look how costly this is. The bird has exposed himself to predators. He's right there and knows it's risky. Spends months making these things, but he has to, and it just shows what a strong, cool, tough bird he is. Yeah, maybe. But more interesting is what he's actually made. Look at this amazing thing. how has evolution produced, the sense of aesthetic where these female bowerbirds know this is what they want, and the males know this is what they have to make.
So tell us about Richard Prum. You've got, one of the things I love about your book is that you've got these portraits of a whole bunch of people who have attacked this question of beauty in nature, and from all sorts of different perspectives and examining different animals and so forth. So, and Prum, I guess, is the world expert on bowerbirds. So tell us a little bit about him.
Well, Prum is not particularly a bowerbird specialist, but what's interesting about him is that he's the one biologist I've met who said the very same thing I just told you. He goes, look, in my field, they're obsessed with their model organisms and their simplistic explanations, but they ignore everything else. Mm-hmm. I never heard a biologist say that. I kind of noticed that while studying these bird songs. I was always afraid to say it just like that. And here was a biologist who said, look, sexual selection is not honest advertisement. It's not advertising the quality of males. It's selecting for beauty. It's like these females they're kind of art critics. What they know how to do is decide what's good. They know what's good and what's bad in the art of how either their potential mates appear or the things that they do. And he's the only biologist who's so prominent in his field who is talking about the evolution of beauty. Mm-hmm. And so he becomes the main character. He's the one scientist who I interview in depth. Because he says, look, it's just me against everyone else. Nobody agrees with me, but I'm right. I don't think that's quite true, but it's a nice place to be. And you might say, like, okay, so this biologist, he's obsessed with beauty. What good is that? Can you actually learn anything practical from this obsession? Well, it turns out you can. I tell the story that what Prum has done is figured out how exactly the shapes and colors of bird feathers appear on the basis of simple laws of mathematics, kind of emergent order type mathematics, how form is made out of the genetic information in single cells, and how you're able to read DNA to find out what feathers will come from just looking at a cell in a bird that might not have even be a cell in where the feather is going to be. And so by just looking at DNA analysis, they've been able to figure out what kind of feathers could appear. And by this method, they were able to, for the first time, figure out what color an actual dinosaur was, a feathered dinosaur. Many of them were quite feathered. In the past, we had many brightly colored, beautiful dinosaurs, all made up by artists, by Hollywood. We never knew what color actually was until Richard Prum used his approach towards the mathematics of basic feather types, and then the genetic information in the cells of these creatures. And so that's an amazing discovery. The feathered dinosaur, which you can see pictures of everywhere. It's all online. It's an amazing discovery, and that's because he was fixated on beauty, and form and how these things happen, rather than so much function and what the feather would advertise. He had to focus on the beautiful phenomenon itself, which is often glossed over by an explanation, and most biologists are thinking too much about function. Too quickly, function moves away from the phenomenon you want to explain. Because to say the function of all bird song is the same, we forget that all the songs themselves are quite different. We're no longer looking at the interesting aspects of those differences.
I just one thing that occurred to me as you're speaking about this resistance of some biologists, obviously not Prum, to really thinking seriously about beauty, is that physicists love to talk about the beauty and elegance of their theories and of these symmetries that they uncover in nature. And they often say that beauty and elegance serve as guides that can help them discover the truth about how electricity and the weak nuclear force are unified and these sorts of things. So why do you think, I guess I'd just like your comment on why there seems to be that split in how these two different fields of science view beauty.
Well, there's two things I have to say about that. One is that there is this kind of tension that in biology, through evolution, a random mutation leads to something that could be preferred. That could end up being preferred enough to help define a species. And that this idea of randomness and mutations leading to a lot of possibilities, most of which go nowhere, but a few of which end up being preferred, is part of it is the sense of arbitrariness. It could be anything. It could go any way, any which way. And that really is a bit of a conflict with notions of physics and maybe also chemistry and the mathematics underlying nature, that certain basic laws of form help to define things. That there are basic rules that determine how nature is formed, senses of symmetry, these shapes you see again and again, the circle, lines, and triangles, and things that people interested in development and form in biology have pointed out. Things like, those that point out that the golden ratio is everywhere, these sort of facts of nature. And this is a level of pattern that kind of conflicts with biology's sense that anything could go. So it's not surprising that physicists will say we're looking for these basic laws of order and form. And in biology, you have in the 19th century people like Ernst Haeckel, who was obsessed with finding parallel levels of symmetry and form throughout the natural world. Darcy Thompson in England, who similar things showing that there's senses of pattern and order at different scales. The same patterns are found throughout nature, from the microscopic to the macroscopic. Mm-hmm. And that this is not exactly what biology, how it is prepared to deal with this idea that anything could be preferred, anything goes. And there clearly is a tension between these kinds of things. The second is the idea that, scientists, often the more theoretical ones, say elegance is what we look for. The right theories turn out to be the elegant ones. Mm-hmm. And I'm very interested, in a later chapter in my book, I talked to Roald Hoffmann, the chemist and Nobel Prize winner, who is also a poet and promoter of art-science collaborations for many, many years. He's been doing that. He wrote this very interesting essay called Abstract Science, where he says, look, there's too much emphasis on elegance in science. It's a quick way to say we care about aesthetics, but look at the stuff we find out. The real world is not elegant. The most important theories, many of them can be totally messy. Complete messiness, and we can't be seduced too much by elegance and simplicity.
Yeah. And,
Hoffman, being a Holocaust survivor himself, he says, that's where the Nazis went wrong. They looked for the simple solution. Look where it took them,
Fascinating. Maybe we could switch to the evolution of the human aesthetic sense. You may know that I had Dennis Dutton on Blogging Heads. I think it was 2 years ago.
I would love to watch that.
After his book,
watch that.
We'll post a link to it along with our chat. And of course, his book, The Art Instinct, had come out, and it was very much, as I saw it, a kind of standard Darwinian explanation of the evolution of art and music and dance and so forth. And you have a lot to say about Dutton's book in your new book. So tell us how you guys overlap or diverge in your views of the evolution of the human aesthetic sense.
Yes, well, Dennis Dutton's book, The Art Instinct, definitely worth reading, is really, you said a Darwinian account. I would say it's an adaptationist account. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right that today Darwinian usually means adaptationist, meaning emphasizing Darwin's earlier work, that everything that we see, human culture, nature, it's all an adaptation to some challenge that the species faced while evolving. Mm-hmm. Whereas I'm trying to say, you look at what Darwin had to say, Darwin's ideas are much deeper and wider than the standard Darwinian interpretation. They also include beauty for its own sake. But what Dutton wants to say is that human art, human aesthetic is part of this evolution. We tend to like landscapes. For example, we like art that looks like landscapes of the kind that we would have seen in the savannah as we were evolving in Africa with these wide open spaces. We tend to like evolutionary stories that have a certain sense of form and order to them, similar to how species evolve, so that the aesthetic that's right for us is that which is useful for us. Mm-hmm. And it's somewhat, it's different than my idea that, the aesthetic that's right for us is whatever we can go off and try out, whatever we can convince people is worth looking at. And the other thing that I add beyond that kind of arbitrary view that the one Prum is pushing is that I'm very interested in aesthetic, human aesthetic, that makes us see the world in a new way and transforms how we see nature. It's a more open, more aesthetic-based, I'd say more creative view as to what aesthetic should be, whether for humans or other animals than Dutton's, which he tries to use adaptationism as a convenient way to be kind of conservative about art and like older traditional things, because they're much more evolutionary, the way things should go. I find, specifically, I find his ideas most convincing and developed when he talks about stories, the sense of story, and, how there's a kind of evolutionary arc to certain kinds of stories and tales that have lasted for thousands of years through history. And he talks a lot about Brian Boyd, who's a literature professor who's written a similar book that's more specifically about literature. I think that's pretty good, but it's more limited what it's talking about. When he generalizes about art, I think he starts to be more limiting, and he's not looking at enough art, not willing to be changed by art. He's trying to decide he likes that kind of art, which is more traditional and is the way people should be, not the way we actually are.
Okay.
But then again, my publisher, who's the same publisher as Dutton's book, says, "Oh, you agree with Dennis much more than you think." And I only wish he was still around so we could have nice debates about this, because I just met him once. He's a very lovely and entertaining figure, and I wish I could have debated him about this and to see whether he says, "You're absolutely wrong," or "We're all on the same side here." What would he actually say?
He was such a charming guy that I imagine he would have found common ground between you.
Probably.
Let's just back up a little bit. Can you just fill us in on what is known about the origin of, let's say, music and visual representation? So I don't know. Do archaeologists know when the first musical instruments were developed, invented by humans? How long ago was that?
Almost all that is known about such things is quite speculative. Mm-hmm. For example, Stephen Mythen, an archaeologist, he speaks of the notion that Neanderthals, an earlier hominid, that they didn't really have language, he believes they probably had music, or a musical kind of communication, much more like birdsong, where they would perform sounds that would be organized and used rather than each sound standing for something else. Another view says, language always comes before music. You need language before you can define musical sounds as separate from linguistic sounds. I don't really follow that view. I prefer the other one, at least because I think many other animals have music and don't really have language. So, for example, Mythen doesn't like the discovery of this bone flute with two holes that many people have claimed is the oldest musical instrument. And he's not convinced that that's a flute. Mm-hmm. But others say this is his ancient musical instrument. So a lot of it is by its nature speculation. We don't know. What we do know is that music has been around as long as we have records of any human activity. So, the general view is music was part of it. Mm-hmm. Whether or not you had instruments, there was singing, there was performance. And in visual art, just although we have ancient cave paintings, a lot of paintings are of animals and of hunting. There's also, from the very beginning, a lot of paintings of abstract forms, spirals, circles, these kinds of star-like images that some people trace to. Oliver Sacks says these are the things you get in migraine headaches and hallucinations. So everyone knew these images through what goes on in the brain to produce these patterns. Mm-hmm. But a lot of it is real speculation. We just don't know. What we do know that there's, the earliest records we have of human activity, art is definitely a part of it. And the art has elements representing real happenings, real creatures. A surprising amount, maybe not surprising, of animals. But at the same time, there was abstraction even then.
The cave paintings in France, those famous, extraordinarily beautiful and lifelike representations of different animals. What are your thoughts about what those artists were trying to accomplish, what the purpose of that art was, and the purpose of art in general? Big question.
Okay, so for the cave paintings, some people say the art for them is very different than for us. It was part of some shamanic, ritualistic thing that we can't really grasp, and that's why they're in caves when you could barely see things, that is part of some whole ritual, and that they survive because they're sheltered. There's probably plenty of other kinds of art that wouldn't survive. I think more that it's more similar to the way we think of art today. They have survived because they've been so well protected. I'm sure there were other paintings that were outside, things that have washed away. And there's petroglyphs and all those kinds of things. I think that they were people's need to the value of imagery, to not just recount external events, but to creatively respond to them. And that people, from the moment they figured out how to do it, were amazed that you can make an image and it could refer to something in the real world, and that it could be beautiful. They all have an aesthetic component. They're not just informative. It's not just like the news.
Well, because in the same debate that's taken place over what the purpose of birdsong is, or something like the these creations of the bowerbird, what's the function? That debate also takes place when it comes to human art. What is the purpose of human art? Ultimately, does it have some kind of instructive social purpose? Does there always have to be ultimately some kind of moral message for art, or can art be purely, or from a Darwinian perspective, the creative artist ultimately is just looking for reproductive opportunities, as opposed to art being purely for its own sake?
Well, it's clearly you can say anything helps in reproductive opportunities, but that's no explanation for something that's so interesting. It takes everything we've got to get reproductive opportunities, but the very essence of being a human being is to do these creative things, to play, to express, to create. This is what we're all about. Just as I think some people will say the purpose of the peacock's tail is just to further mating of the peacock. I would say the purpose of mating in the peacock is to get more beautiful peacock's tails. The purpose of mating in humans is to have more people around, to make more art, to transform the world, to do more beautiful things. You cannot confuse coming up with a function with understanding a phenomenon. Once I say this is what art is for, I do not understand the art unless I spend time thinking about the art itself and taking it seriously. So you have to be very careful with what you want out of your functionalist explanations. You have to be very careful when you go for an explanation like that. Geoffrey Miller thinks the human brain itself is a sexually selected extreme trait. That's what it's all for. This big brain evolved to impress potential mates.
Verbal skills,
sexual selection,
wit, all those things.
Say that again.
Our verbal skills, our wit, all these manifestations of our intelligence are really all about getting laid.
Well, that's clearly a view that tells you very little about these phenomena. So if you want to learn about language, if you want to learn about music or art, that explanation will not get you very far. It's just, it might make you stop asking any more questions and say, oh, well, that's what it means. But anyone who, I'd say anyone who takes art seriously knows that it only works in a very limited sense. It's really not what it's about. It's not going to help you get the girls to spend a lot of time thinking about music and writing books.
Well, especially since
it takes too much time.
It's
better to pretend you've written them. It's better to have dishonest signaling and say, like, look, I've done all these great things, or
Yeah, I mean,
it's better to spend all your time at parties talking about the great things you've done rather than doing them. Actual doing takes too much work, And, so it's a kind of explanation that says very little. You say, fine, maybe it's true, maybe not. It says nothing about what's going on. What's the purpose of art? Famously Ellen Disyanaki, she's like a philosopher of archaeology who sort of says, art makes experience special. Because that idea is a real resonance with all of human and pre-human history. The making of an experience special through art helps to intensify our recognition that it's important. So these cave paintings of hunters is like to value the hunting of daily life, to make us realize its importance rather than just like, I need to get some food. It makes things special. So art can make mating special, the hunt for a mate special. It can make just all aspects of human life special and worthy of attending to. And it's fascinating to think it might be the same for birds. A bird sings, it makes the morning special for the bird. And for those who've looked inside the brains of birds, what goes on when they sing, they see that dopamine is released, says Eric Jarvis, Duke University, when birds are singing, suggesting that, with this, that the birds are kind of addicted to singing. They need to do it. They have to do it, which I kind of suspect something like that's true. We need to do these things. It's of our very essence as evolved beings.
But that still leaves the question of why we become addicted to them, why they give us so much pleasure.
It's just, it's not an interesting question. It's what we are. We have to do this stuff. This is what it means to be a human being, Make art. Sing. This gives us, spend more time with it. It's not so helpful to say, as like infomercials for music do. It's good for your brains. It's good, makes you think smarter. You'll then be able to make more money when you work on Wall Street. If you spend time studying music, it has trained your brains. Fine, you might be able to. But more interesting is like you're a human being. We are musicians. We are artists. This is what we are. We exist from generation to generation to further all these beautiful things. And in this we share a lot with bowerbirds that have to make bowers and decorate them a certain way. With nightingales who have to sing for hours throughout the night. And these are the essence of living creatures. They have their own aesthetic. And
I want to ask you about another...
You might think I'm avoiding the question, but I think I'm...
No, not at all.
Trying to encourage you to... I'm trying to encourage not just you, but people asking this to focus on the phenomenon itself. And rather than be satisfied with saying this is for this or for that.
Another thinker I wanted you to comment on is E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist. He wrote a book, I think about 10 years ago, called Consilience, which was an attempt to envision this grand unification of all the sciences and the sciences with the humanities and the arts. And so I wonder if you can just comment on that work by Wilson and his vision of how this unification would take place.
Yeah, at the time when E.O. Wilson wrote that book, Consilience, it really made me angry. Because I read this book, I said, finally, science and art will be united in this beautiful, wonderful way. And then I said, what? He just says biology includes everything else. It includes philosophy. It includes art. It's going to explain it all. That his field is bigger. It's going to gobble up everything else. I can explain, he says, what makes art work. It's all part of the human biology. Biology is greater than culture, And I felt really betrayed that he would have such a view. And then, then now looking back, and I read it again for this book, I realized, and thinking more about E.O. Wilson, who was also my freshman biology teacher in college, that, okay, his attempt to explain everything may not be so accurate, but look at what this guy has actually done. He's a wonderful writer. He's a really beautiful nature writer. And he has done so much for conservation to try and bring scientists to care about nature and do something about it. And he has also worked hard to try and communicate with religious believers, people who don't like evolution, to care for creation, to care about the environment. And that he's really reached out, and he's even been honest to say, look, I came to conservation late. I should have been a conservationist from the moment I started studying ants, and realizing that scientists should be involved in caring for what they study, and that for decades it was seen as politics, and scientists were generally afraid to go into stuff like that. And that he realized that that it's what he devotes so much time to now, that he should have started early. So that I kind of respect him more, but I still think there's a danger in any discipline. Someone thinks their approach includes all the others. And I'm very interested in what the best way is for science and art to work together. There's many scientists who think they can explain how art works. There's many artists who think that their instant innovations, their creative ideas have immediate scientific value. There's many scientists who become successful and say, okay, now I'm going to be an artist, because that's pretty easy. There's a lot of ways in which it shouldn't be done. And I think that, Wilson's greatest contribution is by example, by what a wonderful writer he is, how he can work scientifically and then step back and write very poetically.
About nature, for example.
About nature and humans. He wrote a novel about humans and ants, and actually, quite frankly, the part about people is much better than the part about ants. He's pretty good writing a novel about humans. I was impressed. And writing a novel about ants, I think, is tough.
Right.
But I recommend it to anyone. Ant Hill. And he's just a wonderfully creative character. Like, who else is going to do that? What scientist is going to write a novel about ants and people, two parallel stories, and have it all be scientifically correct? And what scientist is going to say, oh, I'm really going to go, let's go talk to those religious characters, get them to care for creation. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to say, I am rational and you are idiots, like Richard Dawkins, which is, of course, not going to help anybody, get over these conflicts. Whereas Wilson's much more nuanced, he's more gentle, and he really is worth taking seriously. And
I agree. I'm a huge admirer of his as well, and he's also just a really warm, wonderful person. And you're right. I think you and he actually have a lot in common, just in the way that you kind of cherish beauty in nature and say we should preserve it for its own sake. And I know that you've done a lot of writing on the environment and deep ecology and things like that. And so some of the values that you have are very similar.
Yes, I think I'm going to send him a book today, actually. You inspired me to, because, and in the past I've set some of his words to music. Did this piece in the rainforest where I used things from his memoir, Biophilia, where he talks about, I open the ant colony the way I would the back of a Swiss watch. I never see the colony as more than an organic machine. And then once I asked him, he was debating my friend, the environmental philosopher and magician, David Abram. Wilson versus Abram. What is nature? And this was in Boston in Faneuil Hall, was a meeting hall downtown. And at the end, the questions I asked, Professor Wilson, do you really think nature is a machine? And then he said, oh, of course not. We have many better metaphors than that, but they're too complicated for the general public. And there, I think I would fault him a bit. I'm still waiting for those metaphors to really be explicitly brought forth by Professor Wilson. Like, okay, go ahead, say it's not a machine. What are you going to call it now? Because I don't really think nature is a machine. I think we can make our machines more like nature, and they'd be better, and people are certainly working on that. But, when we trust our machine way of thinking too much, then we're missing things that we can't explain. Just as biology trusts its sort of preset explanations too much, it's going to miss a lot of interesting phenomena that you could explain if you're open to things that challenge the simplistic adaptationist view, which I wouldn't say is Darwin's view, but it is a kind of Darwinian view, where you've limited Darwin to something much less than he actually meant. Darwin was quite creative, very interested in beauty and aesthetics, and threw a lot of ideas out there and today, biologists are a little afraid to go after such questions.
You mentioned another person whose work I know very slightly, Semir Zeki, who has coined this term neuroaesthetics, or I think you're right, neuroaesthetics, which is an attempt to, I guess, trace the neural circuitry underlying our either creation of art or appreciation of art. I wonder if
sorry.
Yeah, just tell us a little bit about him.
Semir Zeki is professor in London. He's a neuroscientist. He's very interested in what goes on in our brains when we're looking at art. Neuroaesthetics is studying what happens in the brain when we're appraising art, looking at it, examining things. And this is a very interesting thing to investigate, but and by necessity somewhat primitive, because we just don't know that much about how our brains work, which is a fascinating thing. We're trying to learn more about it. So we're looking at what happens in the brain when someone's looking at a work of art. And so Zeki is measuring what parts of the brain light up, what happens here or there, where's their brain activity. It's like trying to watch, like looking at a computer circuits. Where does the energy move when it's downloading a file or something like that? Mm-hmm. You'll see something, but you may not explain that much of what's actually happening. But it's a fascinating kind of very experimental area. I just heard a talk the other day where some philosopher was denouncing Semir Zeki and neuroaesthetics. How dare we imagine that when a brain is looking at a field of color, that this tells us about how art is understood. And, this guy was going on and on about how this was going to accomplish nothing. And I was saying, give the guy a break, come on. Neuroscience is so primitive, it's so interesting that someone in that field is actually looking at what happens to people and looking at art instead of, going through a maze or counting or basic mental activities. It's to be applauded that neuroscientists are considering something like that. I wouldn't expect they're going to advance so far at this point, and sometimes Zeki is making kind of wide claims, but by and large he's appropriately tentative in the claims he's making, and he suggests a direction that much more work really should be done in. It really is an interesting place to look at.
One other, we're almost out of time, so I want to bring up one other grand idea that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's a possible connection between art and spirituality, or art and religion. I'm just wondering if you think that going back to some of the first human paintings, drawings, cave paintings, or so forth, to music originally, to dance, whether you think that they possibly served a religious purpose, or whether religion and art at that time were completely fused in a way that, of course, they're not nowadays.
I think in some ways they were most definitely connected then, but I also think they're quite connected now, and people tend to take these things that they think are not religious in a religious way. Like for most people who are not scientists, they take science on faith. Generally, they treat science in a spiritual way. They worship it. We believe what scientists say. And even people who speak against religion, like someone like Richard Dawkins, he's really being very religious about science. He wants to explain everything. He's being completely faith-based about it. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but at least you should admit how you relate to your subject matter. Like rationality doesn't explain all that much why you'd want to care about something. Artists are almost religious about art. They have a spiritual connection to the things they care most about, and these days often don't want to admit that it connects to something spiritual or religious. And with traditional religions, I think going back to ancient times, we can only speculate that these things were much more wrapped up with one another, and there wasn't as a complex distinction between one thing and another. Just think it's not that many hundreds of years ago that science and philosophy really split up from each other. Today, I think, from an individual person's experience, whatever you get involved in that makes you think of some larger organizing force that's bigger than you, that kind of holds the world together, it's approaching a kind of religious experience. And certainly the scientists working on quantum mechanics, or musicians playing something they can't understand, or perhaps even a bowerbird completing his bower and knowing that's just right, are probably on the edge of some kind of spiritual experience. David, but I would say personally, I haven't delved that much into what organized religions and their whole history would say about a remark like that. Well,
I was just wondering, a remark by Steven Weinberg comes to mind, and maybe we can end on this. You could comment on this. He talks about the idea of some physicists that some of the really deep discoveries of physics lead to a sense of the divine in nature, and Weinberg dismisses that by bringing up all the horrible things that have happened in human history. But then he has this wonderful phrase: "I admit that sometimes nature seems more beautiful than strictly necessary." And he just sort of leaves it at that. And I wonder, I actually realized I don't think I've ever asked you directly, do you believe in God in any sense? Do you, are you atheist, agnostic? What are your beliefs as someone who obviously has an acute sense of the beauty of nature?
I feel that, through these experiences, where nature seems more beautiful than it might need to be, or where I feel I'm kind of tapping into this beauty that's larger than what needs to be, that I feel there's some deep spiritual meaning in such encounters. But I don't know. I feel like I have a kind of spiritual belief, and a belief in experiences that can't be rationally explained, but I'm not sure I would say that I believe in God in the traditional sense, or I don't think I would argue strongly against belief in God, saying that it's irrational and things like that. So it's not a question I ask myself that much. I think there's so much that can be learned from religious, ritual experience and literature. Personally, I feel I often don't have enough discipline to learn as much from those traditions as one could, to take them really seriously. I kind of wind my own path through all these things, picking and choosing what grabs me to present a view of the world. No doubt people will criticize this book and all of my books on this idea. He's just picking and choosing what he wants. He just drifts around here. He's not comprehensive. He doesn't really understand the field. He's just telling a story. But I do believe in telling stories and telling a strong, interesting, open-ended story that makes readers and listeners think again and hopefully take nature more seriously. I do believe in caring more for nature. That's really worth protecting. I believe that human beings can do better than we're doing now, and hopefully that we will improve in over the next few hundred years to live in a way where we do learn more about the natural world by being open to it and by asking wider, deeper, and more beautiful questions.
That was a great wrap up. I'll just add that I really encourage people out there to read your books, because you take people on a wonderful journey through nature and down all these different strange paths. I love your books, and I'm sure others will too. So thanks so much for coming on Blogging Heads today, David.
Right. Thanks so much for inviting me.
All right, I will see you soon. Bye.
Survival of the beautiful. Thanks a lot.